Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Finance Committee and public hearing of Thursday, March the 19th, 2025. And usually when we start off our meetings, I go around the table and introduce the members of the committee. I'll start on my right. I'm Gene Budnagan. I'm the chair.
Jim Flynn.
David Remington.
Kelly Barner.
Milind Kanitkar.
Vikram Chabra.
Victoria Pitney.
We're short two people. They're both supposed to be here within the next 5 to 10 minutes, so we'll proceed right now without them. And I just want to also indicate that it's a public hearing, so basically what happens during the presentations, I'll ask the members of the Finance Committee first if they have any questions, and then we'll open it up to the public. So with that, I'll let the school committee proceed, and I'll ask Dr. Sawyer if he'd like to have everybody introduce themselves so the people here will understand who's here and what their names are.
Sure. Good evening, Mr. Budenhagen. Thank you for having us this evening. I'm Erin Boucher, Chair of the Shrewsbury School Committee.
Thank you.
On behalf of my colleagues, Rachel Sharifapur, Sandy Fritz, John Wensky, Rajesh Valagapudi, Dr. Sawyer, Chris Girardi, and Tiffany Ostrander. Thank you for having us this evening. I just wanted to mention that Ms. Ostrander may be needing to leave early. She's defending her dissertation tomorrow. So she's here for the beginning part of our presentation.
And congratulations to her for on her new position and going forward.
Great.
It was a good presentation you made last night. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to, we need a motion to continue our public hearing. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
And we open.
Great.
We can go ahead with the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present the FY27 recommended school budget this evening. The school committee charged the superintendent with preparing a budget that provided level educational services and to address strategic priorities if there was an opportunity to do so. The superintendent has made an initial recommendation of an appropriated budget of $94,631,135. This budget plan will continue to evolve in the coming weeks as cost projections of key areas such as personnel, special education, placements, out-of-district transportation, and state funding evolve. The superintendent will make a final recommendation in April for the school committee's consideration, and the recommendation the committee approves will be presented to town meeting for their consideration and bottom line approval in May. Next slide. The initial recommended budget seeks a 4.75 increase, which is the cap limit per the override agreement between the school committee and the select board. This initial recommendation requests funding at the 4.75 cap level in order to provide a level service public education program while addressing cost pressures and maintaining adequate reserves to address intensifying student needs. It is important to note that this budget only allows for implementation of a tiny fraction of strategic investments recommended by our leadership team, and this is only due to cost shifting from personnel reductions. I will now turn it over to Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Girardi to present the specifics of the budget.
Thank you, Ms. Boucher. On this slide, it indicates the change in FTE in this recommended budget that I presented to the school committee. The first two rows talk about the only changes as far as adding something in our program for FTE. One, a middle school math specialist. Over the past few years, we've added some reading specialists at the elementary and the middle school level that have been very valuable in trying to help students who are not meeting our benchmarks in order to get them closer to the level of success that we want for them at those levels. And based on data, we have some ongoing work to do with mathematics at the middle level, and so this was something that we wanted to provide into the program next year. That would essentially work with small groups of students whose results on ongoing assessments are indicating that they need more support. The second line, the Sherwood School Nurse, currently we have 1.8 full-time equivalent school nurses at Sherwood Middle School. That's a middle school of about 920 some odd students. We are recommending that we increase that second position from a 0.8 to a 1.0. by adding a fractional FTE of 0.2. We do have some students with some significant chronic health conditions there, and just given the level of need, having a nurse there throughout the school day, not coming in a little bit later in the morning, as is the case right now for that part-time position. So that's also within something that would be an add. But we're adding these, as Ms. Boucher mentioned, without any new dollars that are coming into the budget. It's by shifting resources within the budget. You can see below that we have 7 different positions that are recommended to come out of our program that are currently exist. 5 of those are elementary classroom teaching positions. We are reducing those at different schools, one at Patton School, one at Beale School, and 3 at Floral Street School, based on the current budget plan. That's based on the fact that we do have some lower enrollment that has been moving up through some of the grades over the last couple of years at the elementary level. So that is a reduction that we can make and still remain within our class size guidelines at the elementary level next year based on the student population projections we have right now. Additionally to that, one of our English language education teachers at the elementary level, because our census of students that will have those mandated needs next year at the elementary level is going to be, based on our projection, reduced somewhat. We believe we can go without one of those positions. And I should mention the 5 elementary sections, this one ELE teacher section, those will be able to be achieved through attrition based on retirements that we're expecting at the elementary level. And then finally, the homeless family coordinator position, that has been a position that had been funded through the emergency homeless shelter grant funding, some in district budget funds as that's continued, but we do not have a demand given the population of that shelter has shifted significantly in terms of the number of students residing there. So that's something that would also come out of our program. And so an overall net reduction of 5.8 full-time equivalents in this budget plan right now. In terms of existing positions that we need to shift costs into the appropriated budget, the first 2 lines are 2 positions that we added last year, have continued this year. We've actually used that homeless funding that we received from the state, which was a funding stream that was treated as a reimbursement for costs we were incurring as we absorbed those students into our district. We utilize and leverage those funds to create what we call our therapeutic learning center classroom, which is housed where we had some space available at Beale School, although it serves elementary students from across the town. That's been a very successful program. Our estimate by serving the students who are being serviced there now, which I believe is about 5, if those 5 students had gone to out-of-district private therapeutic special education placements outside of the district versus serving them in the district, our estimate this year is that we're saving about $185,000 by having that as an in-house program. But we are going to need to move those 2 positions into our appropriated budget off of that other funding piece, because that funding will no longer be available next fiscal year. Similarly, we have an English language education teacher that's been funded through that funding source from the state, and we need to shift that into our appropriated budget. And then we have 2 IT support professional positions, audiovisual, 2 positions that are both in audiovisual. Due to an accounting error in this year's budget, those positions were not in the final numbers. That was something we discovered as we came into the new fiscal year. And out of transparency, we just need to be clear that we need to add those dollars back in. Those are long-time positions that we're able to thankfully fund this year without any other, based on how our fiscal year is going so far. But we need to build those back into the budget for next year. And then finally, wanted to make it clear that after the budget closed last year, based on some emerging student needs at Sherwood Middle School, we did add a school adjustment counselor position to Sherwood for this school year. So that FTE was added in the current school year that was not originally in the budget. It did not add any additional dollars because our personnel budget at the point where we added it in the later in the summer, we already had been able to make enough hires under budget target that we had enough funds to be able to support that position without any additional adds to the personnel budget, and that will just be carried forward as far as the finances into the next fiscal year, so there's no fiscal impact on FY27 But again, out of transparency, wanted to be clear, since it wasn't in the original budget that we brought to town meeting, wanted to make sure you were aware that we had added that during the year this year. The next slide talks about what our district leadership team requested of the superintendent's administration of the initial budget. Our district leadership team consists of all leaders from our central office level, principals, assistant principals, department directors, curriculum leaders across the district, and they have an opportunity to make recommendations for how they could strengthen their program, address different strategic priorities. We asked them to focus on our strategic plan and what that would look like in terms of how we could advance it. Those recommendations totaled just over $2.6 million. That included the equivalent of 25.2 full-time equivalent positions in the either professional or administration roles, or 8.5 para-educators. As I mentioned earlier, the only new positions that I've recommended are the 1.2, the math specialist at the middle school and the 1.2 nurse at Sherwood. No additional para-educators. There will be shifts in some personnel with under the budget line that we can move, dollars depending on need, and we always have that happening with our para-educators in particular. But there were 24 positions recommended that are not supported in my recommendation, and 8.5 para-educator positions not supported. Obviously, that's because we have a limitation in terms of how much funding we are able to have as far as our allocation from the state or other funding sources from grants and whatnot. So there is a high level of demand for things that could improve our program, very reasonable recommendations, things that many other districts have in place, but we don't have the room in our budget to add those pieces, and it's just important, I think, for the community and for you as the finance committee to understand that that's where we're at in terms of being able to add new things is very limited. As I know that Mr. Mizikar and the municipal department heads have presented the same process that they go through their budget. So with that, am I taking the next slide as well? Yep, I'll turn it over to Mr. Girardi.
Oh, I'm sorry, this one's you.
Well, I will take this one. Oh, sorry, I'll wrap up with this and then turn it over to Chris. As far as, just want to make note in terms of our main source of state funding for public education is the Chapter 70 funds that the state allocates each year. That amount, which you can see on this slide, would be the red portion of the previous fiscal years, and as far as projecting next year, based on the current governor's budget, that's the blue and gold stacked bar, and then the one with blue and green would be if the legislature funds it at the same level they funded it in this current fiscal year. We, as a minimum aid district, will only receive a certain allocation of dollars per existing student in this year's student calculations. That's what we would expect for the year-over-year increase in Chapter 70. You can see that the increases over the last several years, they have been modest. One of the things we talked about a lot when we were proposing the 2021 override is that how over time the funding from the state level had been severely below what the inflation pressures on a school budget would be, just much like local aid on the municipal side. Not effective in that by design it was essentially putting more pressure on local school districts to fund more of their education program with local dollars. I know you're familiar with the report that the Mass Municipal Association put out earlier this year. I think it's called The Perfect Storm, that talks about the structural funding, the way Massachusetts local communities are funded by the state, both local aid as well as Chapter 70 funding in particular, not keeping up with inflation, putting more pressure on local budgets, and resulting in so many communities around the state making reductions in personnel and services because they can't keep up with those inflationary factors. We, thanks to the override in 2021, have been, and a fair amount of obviously of new growth over the last few years in the community and the tax base, have been able to have a stable budget and not be in a mode where we've been cutting, which is, we're in a situation that seemingly the majority of communities in our state are not in right now, where they're making reductions, and we're able to maintain that stability, which is really, again, I will be forever grateful to the taxpayers for approving that override and providing that level of stability to us financially. Next year, again, the governor's budget right now is shown in that blue and gold stack bar chart. That's at a $75 per pupil range. If the legislature funds it at 150, it would be at that green level, slightly higher, the equivalent of, as you can see in the box there, I think it's about 400 and, my old eyes are getting, $437,000 plus dollars is the difference. Our hope, of course, is that the legislature, when the House budget comes out sometime in April, that we see that $150 per student number. That would obviously be a good thing for our town, to have more of that. Those Chapter 70 dollars are the ones that go to the education budget first, of course. That's all they can be spent for. But as last year, when they came in with that 150 per student, which is significantly higher, we had been at $30 a student for a number of years. Then it had gone up to 75 per student in FY25, the 150 per student in FY26. That relieves pressure off of local town funds to fund the school department's town appropriation. Frees up more dollars under the cap system we're in for other town needs, of course. So if that comes through again, that will be of benefit to our community, and that's what our hope is, that's where it will come out eventually for the state's FY27 budget. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Girardi at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So of the $94.6 million superintendent's budget recommendation, this pie chart shows where those dollars are allocated. And I think this pie chart shows, much like we all know, that the school department is very salary driven. Right, 86% of the budget is salaries. And then you see the other categories that we'll speak to tonight, which is our transportation, our special education transportation. Again, transportation at 4%, special education transportation at 1%, special education tuitions at 3%, our vocational tuitions at 1%, contractual services at 2%, educational supplies, equipment, and texts at 2%, and then other expenses at 1%. And we'll speak to each of these categories moving forward. So our staffing category here represents all of the different categories within our staffing. Some highlights here. Again, we're working off of our labor negotiations, our labor agreements with our different bargaining groups, our Unit A teachers, and this speaks to, I think, some of the information that Dr. Sawyer shared a few slides ago with reductions and with moving folks from grant opportunities back into the budget. Looking at a 4.76% increase. This does fall within our negotiations with our Unit A last year, where we came in under 4.25% overall for that contract. Our A3 category is our paraeducator, our aides and ABA technicians. Again, this takes the number of identified positions needed for FY27, identifying the cost per individual and moving that number forward, and that comes in at 4.82% increase from FY26. Again, our A4 secretaries, technology, other non-represented. The increase here really is those two positions that were left out of the budget that need to be moved back in. It's a smaller dollar amount than some of the other categories, so that percentage does jump pretty quickly when you add that almost $200,000 back in. Substitutes, that's something that we're monitoring all year long. We've kind of settled into a trend post-pandemic, where our substitute budget did increase significantly. It's tempered, and we're able to manage that a little bit more stably since over the past few years. And then other wages, employee benefits come in right around 3% as expected. A1 category, the 2.38%, this just represents a little bit of turnover in the administrative level in this category. Our transportation category, again, this one may be misleading. Our transportation contract with AA Transportation is 6% annually. So our B1 category is our regular education, vocational transportation. This is our regular to and from school bus transportation over the 180-day school year. This is offset by our transportation fees. We have a revolving account that receives those fees, and we do apply somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000 a year to offset the transportation costs within the operating budget to bring it down from the 6% increase. Our special education transportation category has a 3.48% increase. We do offset this category as well with our 240 IDA grant, which is a special education grant that allows us to use funds to minimize the impact on our operating budget. Category C are our tuitions. The C1 category is our special education tuitions. This is our out-of-district special education tuitions. This number, as you see from FY25, has gone down year over year. And what this represents is our use of our special education reimbursement circuit breaker fund. So we use circuit breaker to offset the costs within the operating budget by using our state reimbursements to manage the large number within our operating budget. So you see here that the number went down by $112,000. What that means is we used additional circuit breaker funds to be able to offset that cost. Our vocational tuitions, we anticipated the increase this year with the increased students attending Leicester High School, which is something that, again, we anticipated, and this number represents 25 students attending Leicester High School in 9th grade next year, along with the students that have matriculated there both this year and last year. Our D category is our materials, our equipment, our contracted services, and all other. The majority of these categories were representing a 3% increase. Within these categories, there is some play around the percent increase depending on what the service is. When we're talking about services that are bringing in contractors who have an hourly rate, these can be a little bit higher than 3%. When we talk about materials and supplies, they can be slightly under 3%, but on average, we're anticipating 3% increase in these categories, with the exception of our D3 category, which is our textbooks and curriculum materials. This is a category where when we worked with district management group last year, it was an area they identified and we knew about where we had not been funding efficiently over the past few years, and we're trying to play some catch up as to getting this category to a place where it is supporting our textbooks and curriculum materials as we move forward. Historically, if you look, 5-10 years ago, buying hardcover textbooks, if you needed to skip a year, you could, and you could go another year with that textbook. Nowadays, a lot of the textbooks and curriculum materials are subscription-based, and those subscriptions run out, and when those subscriptions run out, we have to renew them. So we don't have as much wiggle room with taking that textbook on another year. We have to get very specific with the length of term that we have within our contracts for these subscriptions and meet those needs. So that's a place where we're trying to fit our budget for that category.
And as you just may recall, a couple years ago, we used some ARPA funds as part of the agreement between the select board and the school committee to take on a substantial portion of a literacy purchase that we needed to make for materials. We've also had the benefit of a variety of competitive, we had a very significant competitive grant of about $250,000 that year we received also from the state for that same program. But there's a variety of ways in which we've offset some costs with competitive grants or other donations made to the school district. Just today, and this is actually new news for the school committee, even we received an email from the 1-8 Foundation that we successfully received a grant of about $62,000, I think, over 3 years for some science materials at Sherwood Middle School, which will obviously help us do more to keep updating our curriculum resources. One of the key points that was made by District Management Group in their report is that because we've had a lot of these one-time funds for curriculum purchases over the last several years, to be wary, because those funds, if times turn more difficult, if grants dry up, if philanthropic donations dry up, if you have too low of a base, it's going to be hard to keep up with the demand unless we bring that up to a little higher year-over-year level. So again, it's in line with what the DMG recommendations were.
Tonight, we're here to discuss the superintendent's FY27 budget recommendation. However, looking at it just year over year does not provide the full story or really what the community needs to assess when looking at the school department budget. And taxpayers should expect careful stewardship of the dollars that are invested in providing public education services. And our school department and our school committee have a proven history of providing excellent return on investment. And when we met with you in March of 2025, we advised you that the school committee had hired a third-party consultant, District Management Group, or DMG, to assess the financial health of the district, and this included analyzing the impact of historical budgets in alignment with district strategy and providing a 10-year forecast, which included district data as well as data from school districts across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the nation. DMG concluded that our schools are effectively managed, produce a high academic return on investment, and our educational services are delivered at a cost per pupil, which is well below average comparable schools in Massachusetts. DMG's historical analysis revealed that Shrewsbury Public Schools delivered strong academic outcomes, performing in the top 15% of Massachusetts school districts while spending in the bottom 15%. And this slide shows that success has been achieved despite spending 13% less than its comparable districts and 18% less than the state average. On a daily basis, Shrewsbury educates almost 6,000 students with a variety of educational needs, including cost drivers such as transportation services and complex mandated special education services. DMG concluded that Shrewsbury Public Schools' educational needs are likely to grow between 4.7% and 4.9% annually over the next decade. We understand that revenue constraints the town must work with, and the preliminary FY27 budget recommendation was made after careful analysis and consideration of all district needs and reflects the resources required to continue to provide level services. Providing educational services across the country is expensive. Inflation factors affect all Massachusetts public schools, and school budgets are subject to inflationary cost drivers that must be managed within the limitations of our expenditure cap. An estimated recommended appropriate school budget of almost or over $94 million is a significant amount of money, but it represents a school district that is extremely efficient and effective, and we optimize our resources, despite spending a total of $25.3 million less than the state average. And the point I want to make is that the key to understanding the budget should really be the why. The number is large, but I think for all of us to understand the need for the dollars, it's the story behind and the why these items are needed in order to continue to provide level services to all students. Thank you.
Yes. Is that it?
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna ask the committee if they have any questions, and I just wanna say, number one, we're gonna be talking about the presentation. We're not getting into the nitty-gritty because we've got a couple more meetings of getting into the budget itself, item by item. So I want to just keep it on a general basis from the presentation itself to start with, and then we'll build from that, so. David, you was first?
Yeah, so on one of the first pages, you talk about the override agreement. And the school department's budget's increased to a minimum of 4.25% to a maximum of 4.75%. That's not what the agreement says. The agreement says that up to 4.25% is given to the schools, which means 0 to 4.25%. So 4.25% is, in the agreement, the maximum you can get, and 0 is the minimum. So it shouldn't be considered a minimum. The other 0.5% comes from the town manager at their discretion, given other things that happen. So I think it is misleading to say the minimum is 4.25%. Now, you have been given more than that every year, but that's not what that agreement that was voted on by the select board and the school board, and it was given to the voters when we voted for the override. That's not what it said. So I think that should be changed and clarified, please.
Dennis?
I did have one question about additional capacity for, not additional capacity, the funded homeless. where you get it's gonna cost $185,000 for this if we don't do it, but it looks like it's costing $200,000 if we do it. Because these two salaries over here come up to $200,000. Is that factored into the savings?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Mr. O'Connor?
In the second one, when you were talking about the elementary therapeutic learning center.
Yes,
And that we had funded through federal grants for 2 years, or both two grants. And you said by funding those positions, we were saving $185,000. If we didn't have those positions, we'd be paying $185,000.
I think the way I would,
I'm just trying to get a
sure,
clarification.
no, sorry, I don't understand. So the savings that we're computing is irrespective of where in the budget those dollars are coming for. Right now, they're coming from a grant from the state. But factoring in those two salaries, plus there's paraeducators who work in that program as well, supporting those students. When you take the amount of those salaries versus what it would cost on a typical out-of-district tuition, which would probably be a minimum of $50,000 a year, add on, usually each of those students would require a paraeducator in that private school placement for another $30,000 a year, plus out-of-district special education transportation for each of those students. That total versus what we're spending in district, our estimate is about $185,000 of savings. Next year, those two positions that are currently grant funded need to move into our budget. The total savings compared to sending them out of district will be the same, but there will be more pressure on our in-district budget because we won't be able to grant fund those anymore. But the amount of savings should roughly be the same amount versus not having that program.
Although the difference was that the grant was paying for it.
Right.
Now we're paying for it.
Yeah. But the net savings either way is still about roughly the same amount of savings for our operation.
Victor, you?
I had two questions, immediate questions. One, Mr. Girardi, category A1, as far as salaries are concerned, I was wondering, the change is significantly lower compared to other categories. Is that something like, aren't we supposed to meet inflation and all that? So 2.38% seems slightly low compared to the other categories.
Sure. So within that category, there's district leadership, there's assistant principals, athletic director, which is our Unit B. And Unit B has, they settled a contract this past spring, which has their the annual increase around 3% or 3.25%, depending on what step they're at. So they're receiving those. Within the district administration, there is some turnover that, we're not going to see the increases that we would if it were that person moving forward with, say, a 3% increase. Given the fact that it's a smaller dollar amount to begin with, the impact on the percent change is a little bit more impactful. It's not a large dollar amount, it's just a little bit more impactful on the percent change because of the smaller number of that category.
Understood. That makes sense. Second question I had was related to enrollment. So based on the data, the chart on page 43 of the budget book, it seems that, like, I remember last year or maybe the year before, we talked about 2020 when we had a massive spike or sort of a decrease in enrollment, and it was attributed, I think, Mr. Sawyer, you thought it was due to COVID. I think you had mentioned it was related to COVID. And since then, we sort of plateaued. Do we have any means in terms of futuristic projections, maybe 10 years, based on expected growth, some models that could help us project needs as far as resources from the schools and budgetary needs that could be built based on this data? I mean, there are a lot of AI machines out there that could potentially give us an idea, if not 100% correct, but within some acceptable range of probability.
As far as student population
Yes,
projections?
student
yes.
population.
So the DMG report looked very carefully at the projections we had already. We did a demographic projection a few years back when we were looking at, was that prior to Beal, Chris? I'm trying to remember when the.
It was 2021.
2021, we had a demographer do a very specific projection. That is something we look at. The town manager does a mathematical projection every year that goes out a number of years. New England School Development Council, we get a projection from them. And so those are all that go out usually about 10 years. We had to do the Massachusetts School Building Authority did a very extensive demographic study of their own as a part of the process for when they granted us authorization to move forward in a partnership around the potential high school expansion project. And essentially what those projections look like going forward, demographically across the state and the nation, there are fewer young students coming in demographically in the next generation. That in Shrewsbury over the longer term, and MSBA looked at this very carefully because they took all the information from Mr. Mizikar and his office relative to housing developments that are in the pipeline and the expected number of students that might come from those. And MSBA uses their own formulas for all those elements as well. And what they project is that there's going to be some plateauing and maybe even a little bit of a dip in the very near future. But then over time, up to, I think theirs goes to 2035, if I'm not mistaken, that is going to start coming back up again as those housing developments come online. And that's going to offset some of the natural demographic reductions that we'd likely see in the community. So we have some of those projections that get updated every year. And then on occasion, I would suggest, and perhaps for Ms. Ostrander, on occasion, I think it's good to do one of those deeper dives with a demographer to be able, and I'm sure they're using lots of different tools now in terms of AI and whatnot to make those projections. Because I think, this is a good example, this budget projection or this budget recommendation that I've made is a good example of looking for efficiencies where if we're able to provide the level of service that we're committed to, in this case, meeting the school committee's class size guidelines, and we can do it with fewer FTE, that enables us to be more efficient with the dollars and shift resources to other demands that may have higher inflation rates, like transportation or special education tuitions or whatever those things might be. But that's going to be an ongoing element that we should continue to pay very close attention to. I absolutely agree with that.
If I could just have one more question that's related to this. So just going to the last page that the presentation that Ms. Fritz basically presented. So, and it sort of ties into the discussion that we just had with Dr. Sawyer. How does our percentage of population of students, so if I just take say about 6,000 just for a best case calculation, that's about 1/7 or 1/8 of the population of our town. So I was wondering, I mean, I think being in the top 15, the lowest 15% in terms of expenditure is very commendable for the town, but I was wondering, how does that tie into other towns? Do they have lower student population, and that's somehow, some way in which we're able to offset costs? Because I'm very interested to know what the reasons are that make us such an efficient town. We do have the data, we have the end result, but do we have any knowledge in terms of what is the reasoning behind that makes us so efficient? Is it student population? We have a greater student population. As a result, we have maybe comparatively larger class sizes and we're able to do much more with less. I'm just asking that question. I'm
Sure.
not saying that that's what it is, but I was wondering if you had some
Yeah,
information.
no, I think, and I'll ask Mr. Girardi to pull up an example of, we have some slides just to refer to different questions we thought might come up. The per pupil expenditure, and it ends up getting broken down by a lot of different categories as well, so we can see where we're, consistently below in a whole variety of places. There are places where the overall is similar to that bottom 15%. Others were less than that, others might be a little bit higher than that. The overall number is 15. I know in the past we've looked at, the 10 communities, with closest us to population on the higher end, put us in the median. What does that look like on a per pupil basis? There's no question that we benefit from some economy of scale. There's no question, for Massachusetts, unlike a lot of places across the country that have very large school districts, a 6,000 student school district is actually relatively large for Massachusetts. I think we're about the 27th or so, if I recall, largest district in the state. Unlike some of the big county districts you might see in the Midwest or the South, that Worcester County itself would be one school district, right? So when you look at comparison in certain areas, we may have some efficiencies for things like administrative costs or elements that would be, but not to the extent that, on the margins of 5% here or there. I mean, being 15% compared to the state average is pretty significant. Are there efficiencies? Of course. And are there things that, obviously because public education budgets are driven very heavily by personnel. There are places where, we don't have the same level of programming that some other districts where our peers would have. We don't have an entire, we've added a couple of business teachers over the last several years. Many of our peer high schools would have entire business departments, maybe with, 8 to 10 faculty as opposed to 2 faculty. That immediately would be hundreds of thousands of dollars more in that cost center. The school committee's class size guidelines are a little higher than a lot of other districts. There are other districts that target, for example, our elementary class size target is 22 at grades 1 and 2, and 23 to 20, or 22 to 24 at the upper elementary grades and middle school grades. There are other districts who target, in the high teens for their elementary grades and maybe, more like 20 for their middle schools. And over, a number of sections of middle school, that has a significant cost savings. We believe they're responsible and reasonable class sizes to have effective, and obviously we're getting effective results, so we appreciate that. So those are a couple of areas where you might see that. The area we talked about before with curriculum materials and those kinds of elements. We tend to spend more on technology than a lot of our peer districts, but when it comes to some of the other pieces, their refresh rates on textbooks and other kinds of things along those lines, I think are probably more aggressive than ours have been over time. So there's a lot of different areas where we might see some of those differentials, but some of it's economy of scale, but certainly we're not providing necessarily as many different kinds of programming or opportunities as maybe some of those districts. You can see on the screen there, that's compared to this year's, the state changes every year based on demographics of different communities, what they consider to be our peer districts socioeconomically, and roughly the same size, so there's some economy of scale there. And as you can see across there, we're the third lowest among those peers, and pretty substantially compared to many of them. If you look locally, it's similar in terms of what those would look like.
And if I could just add, I think either Mr. Girardi or Dr. Sawyer sent you all the DMG report, and there's more information in there, and they do talk about comparable districts, so I think that's an area that you'll definitely find more information.
And could we get the projections till 2035 that Dr. Sawyer
Sure.
mentioned?
Yep, we made a report on that in October. We can send you those links.
Okay, thank you. No more questions.
Dennis is next, then Louis.
I had another question on the staffing. There was, the leadership team asked for 25. You gave them about 4% of it, of 1.2. And so 90-something% reduction of what they asked for, which I commend you for, having that strength to do that. But what are we giving up by not hiring those 24 teachers? And at what levels would they have been? The savings are great, but savings come with a cost. And
Sure.
I just want to understand what that cost is.
I'm just gonna, on my own screen here, pull up something from when we presented the budget originally, slide deck. Bear with for one moment. Well, as I'm trying to find this, and if I find it, oh, here's some general categories. And when I presented my budget recommendation to the school committee back in February, under our strategic priority of educational excellence, some of the things that people had asked for, more reading specialists, more para-educators, to literacy tutors, to support our reading and try to get more and more students up to benchmark. Math interventions and support, that's the one position that I was supporting, but I think they would have liked more, and the elementary would have liked some math specialists as well, did not recommend those. Continuing to have maybe some additional English learner support in addition to what we are mandated to provide on top of it, so we could really move those students faster to proficiency. Some capacity around program implementation and coordination. That would be maybe some additional administrative or curriculum leadership positions to be able to, Ms. Clouder runs a very lean operation. She's, covering the whole entire district, pre-K to 12, in her role as assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction and assessment. So there were some positions like that. There were some requests that would have enabled us to increase some of our in-house career technical education programming at the high school. Of course, one of the challenges there, if we even had the staffing, we don't really have the space. So that's a trade-off there, maybe, harder to add if we wanted to. To improve some class size staff ratios, there were definitely some requests for high school level teachers so that we could offer more electives in English, social sciences, be able to add, have more students be able, right now we restrict the number of math classes a student can take, to have more students be able to have 2 math classes at once if that's what they desired. We would need more math faculty for that. I believe there were 2 additional math teachers requested by the math director at the high school. And then as far as some of our, student behavioral, social, emotional health, some additional counseling support, that's those kinds of things. There was a request to restore. We used to have a health program at the elementary level that was cut some number of years ago prior to this most recent override. We've never restored that. So that was a request, I think, for 2 health teachers at the elementary level to bring that program back to elementary students. So that's a flavor of a variety of things that the leadership team was asking for.
Can I have a follow-up? So when you talk about the English learners and the reading specialists and math specialists, what impact does it have when we have these students that need that help and aren't getting it? I mean, does it cause possible people to repeat a grade, which means we now have a student that we're now going to educate for an extra year? Does it cause teachers, to have to spend more time on 1 or 2 students versus the whole class? I mean, I'm actually a big fan of having these specialists, and we're cutting them or not hiring them. I know there's a shortage of them. But I'm just wondering, what's the cost educationally by not bringing in the specialists to bring people up to speed?
Sure. It is an area that over a couple of budget cycles previous, we did invest in some positions that we hadn't had in a very long time in our reading specialists and in more. We do leverage some of our Title I funding that we get from the federal government for literacy tutors, and then we have literacy tutors we provide through our own budget, which we increase somewhat after COVID as well. I know Ms. Collider recently made a presentation about an update on our literacy initiative, and what we're seeing right now is that at the elementary level, we've had over this past year, we're trending in the right direction. We have fewer and fewer students who are requiring higher levels of intervention. And obviously, anytime you can intervene at an earlier age, that can head off more issues, because once students get to middle school or beyond and they're still struggling with their literacy skills, it makes it more challenging, and frankly, our results won't be as strong, and it affects them and what their opportunities might be if they're not able to be as academically successful. So I think it's having more impact on getting kids to the benchmarks we want them at more rapidly. With more resources, we think we could do that. The resources we've added have had a very positive effect, and we'd like to continue to see that. And if we had more, that would be wonderful. But we're pleased that the resources we have been able to add have been, based on the data we have, are seeing that we're starting to see some positive effects with fewer students needing those kinds of interventions.
And just one last comment. Do we have any that are just slipping through the system and not getting up to those levels because we couldn't intervene early enough?
I mean, we've always had students who are not at benchmark, and that's what, when we talk about achievement gaps, right? We're looking at where are the students. We have a very and frankly, Ms. Ostrander is one of the largest experts in the district in terms of her work that she's done at Coolidge School. We have a very strong implementation of what's known as a multi-tiered system of supports. We're based on assessment data that's ongoing. We make adjustments in terms of how much support individual students can get. Either initially, more support from their classroom teacher who might work with them more frequently in a small group, for example. The next level would be they might get some literacy tutor support, for example. The highest level, smaller percentage of kids might be those reading specialist experts with masters in reading who were doing really high-level dosages of small group targeted instruction. And so that is, certainly we're not 100%. We have very strong results overall, but obviously we want every student as much as possible to reach those benchmarks.
Okay, thank you.
And Dennis, I think from a school committee perspective, I think it's an excellent question, because you definitely want to make sure students are getting the services they need as early as they can to be at benchmark. But if we don't have those services, not only are our students suffering, but if there's a cost to continuing these services
Right.
longer into their educational years. So I think having those supports is vitally important for the student, but also optimizing resources and targeting where we should, and having less cost, like Dr. Sawyer meant, the therapeutic program, hoping that will mean much less cost down the road.
No, that's,
Yeah.
thank you for answering that. That was where I was going with the question.
Just a moment before you go forward, will you just give the number, the sheet you're talking about, so all the
Okay.
committee members can go to them as we're speaking,
Yep.
asking
That was page
questions?
6.
So follow-up to Dennis's question on page 4.
Thank you.
So, so talking about, like the specialist and, we are showing here net savings or reduction of 5.8 FTEs, largely from a math specialist or the elementary classroom sections, while, we have not achieved as a school district the MCAS scores to the pre-pandemic level, right? So that tells us that there is a need, but here we are, whether it is attrition, retirements, anything, we are not filling them back up, right? So there seems to be a contradictory, messaging here. While we acknowledge that there is a need, we are showing that as a savings, right? So that's one point I would like to get your opinion on. The second thing is about the last one says about the homeless family coordinator. I know, Dr. Sawyer, you commented about, the large population has shifted. There is few remaining. The budget does says that, if required, we will, hire a contracting services. What does that dollar amount look like? That I couldn't find. So if you can kind of
Sure.
elaborate on that.
Well, we have, the first level of service that we can provide is a number of years. I think it was the year either of the override or maybe the following year. I think it was the second year. We added, for the first time, we had always contracted out for social work services, but we actually hired our own social worker. She does an outstanding job. And she certainly has worked very closely with our population of students who have been in that shelter since it came online originally when it was on Route 9 further up, and now where it's located currently. Because of the level of need we had, we added this other coordinator because it made sense, because we just had a level of need that was sort of constant as far as that goes. We believe that, with, again, where the level of demand is now, with our social worker, if we needed to, we have a contracted services line item that if we're utilizing specialists, if we needed to get some additional community support for some reason, we'd be able to utilize some of those funds. But, our sense right now is that with our in-house social worker, we should be able to manage those demands going forward next year.
Couple of
Yep.
more questions.
Go ahead.
And then I know there are, on page 5, there are certain things that we are talking about, like we will be losing some grants or something. So do we have a breakdown as to, how much grants and various categories that we receive as a school district? And how much of that is, kind of related to educational services versus other like technology grants or other kinds of grants that goes from a, service provisioning across the board from a
We do, and if you happen to have your school department budget book, or you have it online, page 39, 40, and 41 of the budget book refer to all the different federal and state grants that we receive, and give some general idea of what they're used for. The bottom line is that in FY26 we're receiving about $2.58 million in these various grants. We have to use them for what they're allocated for. They're allocated for certain purposes. By far, our largest grant is our special education grant, which is, where is that on this, Chris? Here we go. Yeah, this year it's about $1.77 million. The vast majority of that we use for special education out of district transportation, but some of it we use for some other purposes. And these grants are heavily regulated by the state. The federal grants are, even though they're federal dollars, they're regulated by the State Department of Education. They're allocated that way. One point actually I'd like to make that's new information that I believe Ms. Clouder referenced when she presented to the school committee last week, is that we just recently got guidance from the State Department of Education to expect and plan for a 15% reduction in our Title I federal grant services, Title I grants are generally based on the level of low-income population you have in a community. And they're saying that, but they're allocated to states based on how that state sort of ranks nationally as far as low income. And based on an updated census, Massachusetts as a whole is going to receive about 15% less funding from the federal government. The good news is, I think a year ago we were here talking about how we were concerned about the potential volatility of whether federal funding might get cut in some way based on what was happening at the time at the federal level. The good news is, based on the federal timeline, grant funds that would be received for FY27 have already been approved at the federal level. They were essentially approved at about a flat rate. Even though Title I was approved nationally at a flat rate, Massachusetts is going to get less money because it's going to be redistributed in different ways based on census. For us, that impact, I think, is about $34,000. So when I make my final budget recommendation to the school committee for town meeting consideration, we need to figure out a way to reduce our reliance, and those funds typically fund literacy tutors. There's a whole variety of other smaller grants. Some of them are for teacher professional development. We use most of those dollars for a state mandated mentoring program that all of our new teachers must have. And we pay a stipend to teachers who serve as mentors, and virtually all of that federal grant is utilized by Ms. Clouder for that purpose. So it's a way for us to fund that mandate. There's a whole host of other things there, Mr. Kanakar, that, we're certainly happy to respond to any of them, but that's where they're all listed. And from year to year, sometimes they shift in funding a little bit, again, depending on our own census, the state's census, all those kinds of elements.
If I may just add a quick piece to that is, with the federal funding, when we say that they're flat funded, as we're moving forward, items within those funds that we, there's inflation involved, right? So what we pay out of those funds has an inflationary factor. So that's also something beyond the $34,000 is the inflation that the things we pay out of those accounts accrues going into the next year. So it's slightly higher than that. And the second piece on page 41, it does show at the bottom of right above the totals, the expanded homeless shelter funding program. That's slightly different than, say, a state grant in that it's a reimbursement based on the number of students that we had, based on the number of days they attended. So we got $103 per day per student who qualified for that program that we received to educate them. It's parsed out over a number of years. It was really 2 years. But the way that the funding was distributed is they counted the number of students we had in a year all the way through the end of the last day in June. A lot of times those funds would come in July or August. So they would show up on the next year's fiscal schedule, but they're funds that were granted within that fiscal year. So if you see it's kind of parsed out over a number of years, it's kind of tricky in the way that that's when it hit our books, but that's not really when those funds were dedicated to us.
I think I would just add that Mr. Girardi and Ms. Fitzpatrick from his office, who coordinates our grants for us, do a really excellent job making sure whether that's an entitlement grant we get or that's a competitive grant we've been able to earn from the state that comes through that process, that we're utilizing those dollars effectively, and that, oftentimes because of the federal budget timeline is a little different than the state timeline, when we receive funds, how we can use them over time. If our needs shift, we can write amendments for those grants and utilize, it has to be within their overall purpose, but we might be able to shift. Sometimes we think we're going to spend this much on literacy tutors, but at the end of the year, we're going to have maybe, some $1,000 left over that we can then write an amendment and purchase some literacy materials with. We want to expend them appropriately, but we have a runway to expend them, because they're usually being stretched over multiple fiscal years to some degree, so that we can make sure we're using them as effectively as possible.
And on the last slide.
Go ahead.
So I know, it's good that, we are in the top 15 percentile and lower 15 from a expenditure perspective. But do we have like a breakdown in terms of, low to middle income families? How are those students performing? Are they where they are from an expectation perspective? Because the expenditure for them as a family is the same, right? So are we hitting that benchmark? And if we apply that filter, how do we look? I think that is a good data to showcase, because that's where we can see whether progress is being made or not.
Sure. I'm just logging into just the public website from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And there's a wealth of information, on those websites. If you select Shrewsbury and look at the various elements of our statistics, and I want to take a look here. For example, you can look at MCAS results by different student groups, and you can access, it's not coming up for me right now, but you can access what our results are for students who are considered to be low income. And year to year, overall, which is not atypical, there is a gap between students who qualify as low income and their performance versus the performance on the whole of our community. Socioeconomics have a strong effect oftentimes, but at the same time, and I will again commend Ms. Ostrander, among all of our elementary schools, Coolidge has the largest percentage of families that would qualify as low income. Yet Coolidge outperforms, I think, 92% of the schools in the state at the elementary level in terms of metrics that the state uses on a variety of levels. So I think there's examples where we outperform our demographics. But we do look, there's a variety of ways the state measures. They even talk about high-need students, which means they qualify in one or many ways, whether they, may be a student, a low-income student, a student who has special education needs, a student who is an English learner. There's a variety of ways that they could qualify as that, and that's something the state pays attention, holds us accountable to in terms of performance, and they expect improvement for all those subcategories as well as our overall performance. So it's something we do pay a lot of attention to.
Thank you.
David, you were next?
Yeah, just to follow up on the same thing, 4 and 5. Of the 7 FTEs that are being reduced, how many of those are reduced in fiscal 27?
This is for fiscal 27.
So there can be 7 retirements.
Yes.
Additional questions?
No, I mean, in the salaries with, so it's 4 additional people coming onto salary, plus the 1.2 FT, so we have adding 5.2 people to the salary and getting rid of 7. What's the cost savings?
I'd have to look at those specific pieces, but, a teacher hiring is typically making around the order of 110,000 to 115,000, give or take, depending where they're at on the salary schedule.
Okay.
So you can presume that's, multiply that times 6. And then, in terms of what the specific salaries of those other elements, those are listed there, so you could certainly do that math.
Okay.
Any additional?
I have a couple.
Yes.
Page 4. I was just curious, Melinda asked earlier, on the homeless family coordinator reduction, could you just comment maybe on we're decreasing it because students are no longer in the program, maybe what the peak was versus what it is today? And I guess I'm more curious, Dr. Sawyer, what does 1 FTE equate to?
In terms of cost?
No, not cost,
okay.
just bodies. Was it 30 students? Was it 50? Are we down to 10?
What was the peak, Chris?
So in FY24, when we had the peak number at the hotel, I think our top number was 54 students.
Okay.
We carried that number for about 2 years. Last year, we had 26 students,
Okay.
primarily at the elementary level. This year, we had, I believe, 9, and 5 of which were students who had moved out of town, but were being the McKinney-Vento transportation, which we were their home school. They preferred to go to school in Shrewsbury, so we were transporting them back to Shrewsbury just to have as minimal of an impact on their educational transitions as possible.
See.
So at the end of this year, they will no longer qualify for that opportunity. Looking at FY27, as far as students who were part of the homeless shelter, we're looking at maybe 1 or 2 in FY27.
But also to be clear, we have other students who qualify as homeless who are not in the shelter. We have
Right.
students who end up becoming homeless and moving out of town to double up with a relative or friend, for example. And under the federal McKinney-Vento law, we are obligated and mandated to offer those students to remain educated in Shrewsbury schools and split the cost of transportation with the new community they're living in. That happens the other way around as well. Sometimes we'll have a student who would move to Shrewsbury, they want to stay in their home school, we split the transportation of getting them back to their district. In some cases, they do want to enroll in Shrewsbury and we take them on. But some of the coordination work, I mean, it was very, very heavy at the shelter when we had those numbers, of course. But again, our social worker and the coordinator who's been on, and this year have been able to kind of reduce in a variety of ways, even in the current year, in terms of that impact. But so shelter has gone so low compared to where it was.
Right.
We don't feel we need to carry that position any longer.
And I did miss one important piece that I think is important to mention.
Sure.
Out of the shelter, part of that program was to place families in permanent housing. And over the course of the few years, there were about 10 families who were placed in housing in Shrewsbury. And those students are still being supported by the homeless family coordinator, supporting those families with maintaining rent and those sorts of things. But primarily, this position here, making sure that those students are accessing education, getting transportation to and from school, a lot of the primary needs to make those students part of our community.
Could you just share that number?
I say it's about 10 students who.
Just 10?
Yeah,
Okay,
I think it's just short of 10.
okay, 10 students, thank you.
One more, Gene?
Yes, go right ahead.
There's been a lot of reference to the DMG, did I get that right, the consulting group?
Yep.
When you reflect back on it, and I do remember that coming up last March, I've read the report. I know there was a lot of talk, heavy reliance on grants, fees, et cetera. When you look at the results of that report, did you have a baseline going in of what you might expect them to provide, and were there any surprises? Does that make sense?
Yes. We didn't have any preconceived notion going in.
Okay.
Because we wanted to have a clear assessment, historical,
Mhm.
and then doing the forecasting going forward to see were we on target historically, and going forward, what were the estimating costs going to be looking at educational services nationwide. So I was not surprised by that, looking just at inflationary costs, the number of students we have, and the recommendations that they made, I think were spot on. Maybe those are some things we were thinking about, and looking at how do you deliver educational services today versus 2 years ago. And we actually have DMG working for us right now, looking at that exact, how, delivering educational services. So I think it was very valuable to do. It gave us good information, and it gave us a roadmap in areas that we should be looking at for better efficiency.
Great. Thank you.
Any additional questions? Just before we open the public, I just have a.
I'm sorry, Gene. Can I
Oh,
just-
excuse, go.
Sorry. So speaking of that report, right, when I read that report, a couple things jumped out at me. They used 4.25% as your base. And they said that's your base funding. And then every category they found to be below 4.25, they increased it to 4.25. So you look at the chart, it's 4.25. They said if it's below 4.25, so if you're going to use that as your base and you're going to increase everything to that base, they came up with 4.7 to 4.9, but with a couple caveats. The assumption is you don't have the fees, you don't have the grants coming in. So now you're relying more on the town money. So when we say 4.7 to 4.9, there's a couple assumptions there. One, that your base is 4.25, that everything that was below 4.25, they're going to raise it to 4.25, and that you don't have the grant money coming, which we do, and you don't have the fee money coming, which you do. So I think as we say those numbers, we have to know that there is caveats to that. And when we did that report, they were saying to you, hey, if you don't get money from from these outside sources, stop relying on them, go to the town, and if your base cost was this, that's what's going to be. So I think there is, the report wasn't, to me, saying you need 4.7, 4.9. It was saying if your base was this, and you don't have grants, and you don't have the fees, then this is what you need. So I think there's a difference in how we message that, okay? For me, was without these other incomes, that's what it is, not that you need that now.
And I think I disagree with that. I think there was a lot more assumptions. If you read through their report that they included, it isn't just without fees or philanthropy. There's other assumptions that were made looking at educational services and costs, again, on a nationwide level and inflationary factors. So I think, I agree that's a part of it, but I don't think that's the complete story.
And I would just say this, if we just look at that chart, and they say, if anything we feel in the future is below 42.5, we're gonna raise it to 4.25, that inflated the final number. And I do think that's a very important thing, to get a final number based on an inflated number.
I would also just say that the note in the report says the baseline growth rate of 4.25% was calculated through a combination of benchmarking with similar districts in Massachusetts and research and trends in public education spending. So to suggest that somehow they just pulled that out of thin air and said that's ours because it happens to be the number that is connected to our override agreement would not be accurate. It's a benchmark based on what other districts have proven over time to need and what the inflation rates are in education, which isn't particularly surprising because the 4.25%, and to go back to your original, I know it wasn't a question, it was a comment, Mr. Remington, but frankly, I would object to a suggestion that we're being misleading. I think that's a strong word. But in terms of the entire override campaign, the agreement between the two boards, you clearly quoted what the agreement says. The way that this has been structured, talked about, assumed, we've been doing this now for 7 fiscal years? And the idea of these baseline rates up to the 4.25% is that number was derived based on a lot of work that was done at the time, Mr. Collins, who was in Mr. Girardi's seat, Mr. Mizikar, around what traditionally the school department had needed to maintain its services and potentially make some, strategic investments around the margins. We had the one big year, of course, so we could open Big Spiel School, and we had to add a number of staffing to meet pent-up demand where we'd had overcrowding, which obviously appreciate the community supported that. But it isn't as if the 4.25 in the original override agreement came out of thin air or was some guess. It was based on a long history. There had been a study that was done that Mr. Samia, Dr. McGee, Mr. Collins had done some number of years ago, doing forecasting out. It was remarkably similar. So I would disagree that somehow this is like a plug number that isn't based on something in the report itself. Notes very specifically, it's based on benchmarking and inflation rates, not just on what our base happens to have been in Shrewsbury.
So Dr. Zerl, all I'm saying is when the school board keeps using the words minimum and baseline, and the agreement says up to, they're not logical equivalents. And I think we have to be accurate in our language. You're getting more than that, that's fine. But to say to people, this is what the agreement says, and it's not a logical equivalent by changing the words, I think that is something that should be noted.
Mr. Budenhagen,
Yes.
could I respond as well? To
Go ahead.
Mr. Arlington, I think you're taking it out of context. If you look at the agreement, it does say increases up to 2.5% annually, but then you have to go further into the agreement, DI, which does talk about based on the, any increases, we can get an up to 0.50% increase.
Yeah, I
It
see
is
that.
listed right in the agreement, so to say that what we're saying, 4.75 is not there, it's in the agreement, and it's spelled out, and it was carefully crafted back when we did this. So I think we want to make sure the full context is given, so anybody sitting here or watching understands what the agreement guidelines are.
And I think they should read it, because what it says is that you may get up to an additional 0.5%.
Yes,
And I said that in the beginning. I have no
you didn't.
disagreement with 4.75 being the maximum in the agreement, absolutely. But 4.25 is not your minimum in the agreement. And that other 0.5% says may, which means it's optional if the town manager give it, given certain financial projections. So the 4.25, the 4.75 is an optional money based on how much money we have and other factors that he takes out after he takes money out for the stabilization funds. It is up to a maximum of 4.75, absolutely, if the town manager wishes the extra 0.5% to go in. But it's not a minimum of 4.25%.
So I assume you also feel the same way for the municipal piece, which is up to 3.5.
If that's the maximum they get in the agreement. And so, again, you know, I just want to be accurate about what we're saying, because it leads to, I'll call it mistrust. If we're calling this document and we're saying that's the minimum, and people read it and they go, that's not the minimum, then it seems like we're doing something that we're not doing intentionally. Because I know you've talked about the 4.25 being a baseline, which is the way you calculated it. But when we refer to the agreement, it doesn't say anything about a baseline in there of 4.25%. So it gets very confusing to people who read the agreement and hear a baseline, and they don't understand that the two words aren't meant to be the same. Does that answer your question?
I don't have a question about it. I fully understand how this was agreed to, that to tenet and be what we did with the select board, and I respect what you're saying, but I think we have to be very careful how we speak about it so everybody understands
Absolutely.
how it's developed.
Right. And it was put out, and that's what we voted on. These are the maximums the school, the town, and the shared costs are going to be, and then discretionary funding of up to 0.5%. I mean, obviously, if something horrific happens or something unusual happens, of course. But, and the school has benefited from more than that 4.25 every year, and that's fine. But I just bring that up because we have been using that word, which is not the words in the document that you're referring to.
Well, I would say it's interpretive, so, but thank you, I appreciate your comments.
Victor,
Yeah, my last
Yeah.
question. So just in reference to the report and the numbers of 4.7 and 4.9, I think many of us agree that the quality of the schools are extremely important to the town from many perspectives, whether it's our real estate values or the quality of citizens we're creating in giving them the skills and the ability to think critically. So many of us want to support these sort of initiatives to help the schools, but the past few budget sessions that we've been having, I think many of you are aware who have viewed the budget sessions, budgets are extremely tight.
Yep.
We have other services the town has to basically consider. There were a lot of discussions we had on Tuesday night with various departments, which were very concerning. So I want to know from the school's perspective, the school committee and the management, what are the options we have if such numbers can't be met? You mentioned grants and fees, because things are difficult and things are tight, and we have unpredictable economic conditions in the horizon. So are there ways we can be creative here?
You want to start? Do you want me to start? So, I mean, the gap between is that 0.5%, right? Could you pull up the slide with that? Just kind of shows the difference between the two. As we've always done, as long as I've been in this role or previously in my time as a principal, the school department will make work whatever allocation we ultimately get. As we often would say at this point in time with the budget process, numbers continue to evolve. I mean, the Chapter 70 slide that I showed, if the legislature comes out with a budget that essentially doubles the increase compared to what the governor's budget says to be the equivalent of what we got this current fiscal year, that's going to be $470,000 some odd dollars more that the town will have available for funding, specifically for education. I'm not suggesting that the decision will be made by town meeting to allocate all of that to the school department, but I mean, those dollars have to come to the school department, of course, because they're education dollars, but in terms of the rest of the funding that comes from the town. We may have, Right now, for example, in our circuit breaker reimbursement, we have an initial estimate of what we're going to receive for next year. We will get a better estimate in about a month probably. We go through an exercise with the state every year where whether we think we're going to qualify, which we won't, for something called extraordinary relief for special education costs. We go through the process of what our costs are this year and apply, because it mimics what we will be saying our eligible costs will be for reimbursement next year through circuit breaker. It will give us a tighter estimate. If our current estimate is under by a little bit, there could be some additional dollars that would allow us to offset costs more and still stay at the 50% carry forward benchmark that the school committee sets. We are constantly looking at, our biggest number is personnel. We know of existing retirements right now. We could have other turnover where we might be able to realize some cost savings. That's something we monitor closely as, we start to hear from, we have roughly 1,000 employees. There's always changes that happen in terms of people who decide they're going to leave after this year, whatever it might be. If we feel we could make some differential there's some possibilities. In other discretionary areas, we could cut back and shave. This budget, and to be clear, this is the superintendent's recommended budget. The school committee has not made a recommendation yet. They will in April. But this was the budget with that based on what we were charged with providing in terms of level service and responding to what the different inflationary factors are that I felt was necessary in order to bring our program forward. But if ultimately the number is less than 4.75, and that's not offset by other funding sources, we will have to make reductions in one way or another. And certainly, if we're still at that point when we get closer to town meeting, we will illustrate, because the school committee will want from me, when they make a final budget determination of a recommendation, they'll want to understand what my recommendation at least is for what the difference would be between those two plans.
With that, I'm just going to ask one question. I'm going to open it up to the public for their comment. On page 12, I was just kind of flashed out at the equipment, and utility, and telephone. I didn't see those line items in the main budget. What is included in that equipment?
It's one line item, and it is the Zoom telephone service that we and the town both access. The $82,400 is the school department's share of that telephone cost.
From the town? The town portion?
It's a town-wide program that both the town system and the schools use. It's a
And basically,
interconnected program.
what's in the equipment?
And the equipment,
Equipment.
that's primarily, that D7 category is primarily instructional technology. It's tech. That's where things like iPads, computers, it's the physical technology part of the budget.
Now, are you on a program where you're replacing computers every 3 to 5 years?
We're on a lease cycle with Apple, or with an Apple affiliate that we run those programs. It's, depending on the device, it's somewhere between 3 and 5 years, depending on life expectancy and kind of how the turnover, how our experiences with the turnover happens with the devices.
And is that coordinated with the town side also? in the
Not
purchases?
currently.
not.
The school-based technology program is, we are independent from the town.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With that, I'm going, another question?
Nope.
No, I'm going to open it up to the public to see if anybody has any questions, and I would just ask that you give your name and address, and you would come forward to the podium if somebody has some questions of the school committee. Yes. Come forward, Mr. Richard.
Hello, Greg Richards, 16 Hickory Drive. I do appreciate the opportunity, to collaborate with the Finance and School Committee this evening and to kind of look for some creative ways to fulfill our fiduciary responsibilities to the taxpayers, while we do make sure this process is entirely transparent. While I am a member of the Select Board, I am here speaking on my own behalf as a resident and as a town meeting member. And some of the things we may discuss here or might bring up might be uncomfortable, but I really believe the community will be better served because of it. And I feel an obligation, personally, to do my due diligence when we look through these things and to be prepared. but I want to make sure that that's a two-way street as well. You know, you can't really completely understand a book when you only read a few of the chapters, you know, and some of the information and data around the whole budget isn't easily accessible, even for someone who is a select board member. So that's why I really think it's critical we have this open dialogue this evening. You know, I know we talked a lot about already the override agreement letter, but there is a section in there I do want to highlight as well in section 1E where we talk about complete transparency to the residents on all revenues and expenditures, you know, through public meetings and information posted. And there is an area in the book that I do want to ask some questions on. I'm looking on the budget request here on the other expenditures. And the reason I want to bring this up is I understand that we're talking about the town appropriated budget, but you got to look at the full picture of all the revenue sources. And specifically, the funds listed there do represent, you know, 15% of the appropriated budget. Yes, Dennis?
Which page are you on?
It's page 23, Dennis, I'm sorry. So the fiscal summary, all funds. And the reason I wanted to highlight it is there is some discrepancies I guess I want some clarification on. Because like, as I mentioned, it's a significant amount of money. We're talking about 15% of the money and, you know, 25, 13.8 million, 14.7. The one area just to begin with is grants. I know it was brought up earlier this evening. We referenced page 41. And when you look at page 41 about the itemized grants, if you look at FY25, and a lot of what I'm going to focus on is FY25 specifically because it's the last full fiscal year we have. We're still in 26. So if you look there, the number at the bottom total is $2.94 million for all state and federal grants. But if I go back to page 23, you can see those sum total together would only be 2.4. So there's about $500,000 missing. And not only that, the other document I do want to reference, it's not here, which I would ask the finance committee maybe to add, or the school department to add, is the end of year report, which is referenced underneath the paragraph on page 23 where it says budget requirements of the DESI end of year report. So that fiscal year end of year report I do have and I've looked at, and those numbers are significantly different than what's shown on this chart. So I guess I would just ask, what is the correct figure? Because historically, year over year, if you look at the differences in those revenue sources from what's shown on the chart on page 23 to what's reported to the state, there's differences between 9 and 25%. Between budget and actual, and then even between what's reported to the state. So for instance, 2025, it's showing 13.89 million. That budgeted number, which isn't shown, was 12.7, but what was reported to the state was 16.6, which isn't any of your materials, it's just in the end of year report. So there's a significant gap there when we talk about $2.7 million from what's shown here to what's reported to the state. So what is really that revenue source? That is the question. Like, what is the scope of that revenue? And why is there such a variance?
Just pulling up a chart here, if I have it.
I would just like to add just one comment on some of these questions. If you feel uncomfortable, Mr. Girardi, at this point, just we'll get the information and get back to him on
Sure.
there rather than.
I'll share this here, and I'll just speak high level to this. Is you know, this book that's presented here, it's the kind of the state model put out by Massachusetts you know, Association of School Business Managers, and it's the pretty standard book that's used across the district, and it's the template set that's used to really target the appropriated budget, right? Because that's what this book is asking for. Having said that, there's a couple of different pieces here, and that's what is received in a year, and that's what's spent in a year. The on page 23, the fiscal summary, all funds, the FY25 numbers, what's the discrepancy there between that and what's listed on page, I believe, 40 and 41, is the expanded homeless shelter grant. Those dollars there, if you remove those dollars, the federal and state grants do line up. And again, when I spoke to the expanded homeless shelter grant dollars, the other piece is when those dollars come in, right? So when we receive those dollars, when they come in, is different than when we are granted them. So in FY25, we're granted a certain amount. They come in 4 quarterly cycles often, and sometimes that fourth quarter comes in July or August, which pushes those dollars into the next fiscal year. So we're going to see discrepancies over time around what dollars are showing up. Conversely, in our end of year report, those are dollars spent. It's different than what the dollars received are. And this slide here shows different funding sources, our appropriated budget, which we need to spend within that calendar or within that year, July to June, and we fully expend that grant. Our state grants, they're typically also the same calendar, 12 months, July to June. There are some carryovers that can happen with those grants, primarily with circuit breaker. And then our federal grants, our entitlement grants, are different. They're 15-month grants given in July. They can carry forward a year plus 3 months into the following September, and they have a standard 12-month extension. So when we're looking at the end-of-year report and we see dollar amounts expensed in state and federal grants, those are dollars that accumulate over time that are spent, that Dr. Sawyer spoke to a bit earlier around. They can go past a fiscal year. When they show up in the end-of-year report, they do show up as being spent in that year, but they may have been granted to us in a year or two previous. I will say with our end-of-year report, when those reports are audited, we just had it audited and we received a positive audit back just last week. When they look at those grants, they track those grants over time as well. So if those grants weren't spent appropriately during the time that they were given, they would let us know that, and that did not happen. So that's just a big picture overview. I'm happy to dig deeper. If you want to send me questions that are more specific, I'll happily respond to them.
Just had one quick question. You mentioned audits. So obviously the school budget gets audited by outside the state every year.
Every year.
And if you were to show us the last 5 years of audits, they'd be in order? I'm assuming, I'm just saying it's, because this is, it is a serious matter if this is what of what's been brought up. So you have the backup audits to show that things are in order. I will say I don't quite understand school budgets completely because you're right, money comes in, it gets spent. It's a grants come in late, et cetera. Yeah, I think it'd be nice to, if they're public record, to see the audits.
I have shared out the last 5 fiscal year end-of-year reports. Those end-of-year reports have been audited. The one that hadn't been audited when I shared out was FY25. That has been audited, some minor changes, but all changes were typical changes, and it has been approved. And now it's off to the state. So it gets audited first internally by us and the town accountant's office.
Okay, town accountant.
And then it goes to a third party, which we use Scanlon Associates. They audit our full budget every year, which is all the information that's on page 23, which is in our end-of-year report. And then it gets sent to the state. The state does their final audit, and that's when we get the thumbs up from them.
So it's audited roughly 4 times?
Roughly 4 times.
Yeah. By people that actually understand in depth how the funding works.
That's correct.
Okay, it'd be great to see them, but thank you.
We'll let Mr. Richards continue.
Okay. So the other ask, I think, just as general as the finance committee, is having actuals reported versus budgets in prior years. And I'll explain why, because 3 of the sources, let's just say, in their athletics, and then other local receipts, I know do include things such as extended day, summer enrichment, transportation, what have you. But, like, when we talk to residents, I think fees have come up a lot, and I think people in this town are kind of getting feed and taxed to death. And one of the questions, I have just is, I think there's an expectation that when we're spending money or parents and are providing funds for specific activities, that those funds are spent completely in those activities. For example, one of the other pieces, in that report to DESI shows specifically for a revenue source how much money comes in, how much money goes out in the calendar year for that. And there are revolving funds. I get it that there can have money left over. But things such as athletics, if you're paying fees for a student, you assume that all those funds are getting exhausted to help fund that. So athletics, extended day, and summer enrichment all have surpluses. The total of those surpluses over $200,000 in 2025. Those funds are in a revolving fund, I understand, and are going to be expended at some point, but the expectation, I believe, of the families is those monies are used in that calendar year so that their student can participate in that program. So if we don't need those funds or that amount of those fees are not necessary, why aren't those funds going to there? Because athletics, part of the actual appropriated budget goes to athletics. So do we need to appropriate as much funds to athletics if there's more funds that come in through fees that are not being fully consumed? That's just, a general question I have about, is there a reason why we don't always exhaust those funds for those purposes? If somebody says, here's what it costs to send my student, we're gonna spend that money for that purpose.
May I address that?
Yes,
Thank you.
Mr. Durante?
So revolving accounts have a cadence, right? If you look at July 1 to July 1, it gives numbers, but it doesn't really tell a story. We take in transportation fees, for example, primarily through April, May, June is our biggest time of year. So we'll show hundreds of thousands of dollars in that account. Come August, when we start to pay the bus company, right, we take probably about 85% of that budget. We transfer those funds into our transportation costs, right? We pay AA transportation because we pull in those funds to pay for regular transportation, and that's the only thing we can use those funds for. So we pay about 85% a year of that fund to supplement the transportation cost, as I had shared earlier. Right? If you're looking at it on July 1, it looks like that number's that. What I will share with you in the end of year reports is it does have an area where how much money we take in and how much money is spent. So you can see very well for yourself where those are. Some years we take in a little bit more. There's a cushion there. We know in subsequent years we have a new bus transportation contract coming up. There's an opportunity to have some funds on hand to make up a difference if that new contract comes in at 8% versus 6%. Right? We're trying to play the short game, but we also look at the long game, right? So transportation, athletics, last year we were pretty close to spending everything that we took in that went out with athletics. Now, if you look at another fund, which was our gate fees, we didn't do as well last year, right? So there's some offset there that we have to take a look at where we need to understand where different funds are coming in, and we need to make sure that each revolving account at the end of the year has a positive balance.
We need you guys to go to
Yeah.
more games.
Yeah. And I think extended day, same thing. All dollars that go into extended day are expended to extended day. And that those are not places where we can store money and use for other things, right? It's, to Vikram's point is, are there other places where if things get tight that we can tap into? Some revolving accounts, we do carry a positive balance because that's fiscally responsible. Our preschool tuition revolving account, we do keep dollars in there, almost about a year's worth of expenses, because we're nervous about what might happen in the future, right? If we're forced to go to universal preschool or things like that, we have dollars in the bank to be able to account for that. But outside of that, primarily our revolving accounts are dollars that come in for a very specific thing, and they go out to a very specific thing, and they cannot be used for anything else. The big one is our food services, right? Our food services is once we went to universal meals, our participation rate for meals went from about 42% to over 80% of students accessing meals every day. We're getting reimbursements from the state on that. There's a healthy amount of dollars in that account that we would love to use for something else. We cannot. Like, we have to use it for paying our food service staff, paying for food, updating equipment, and that's pretty much it. We tried to pay for custodians to help clean in between lunches, and we couldn't even do that. The state wouldn't allow us. So all these funds are really they're very regulated. We manage them as responsibly as we can. When more money comes in than we expect, we account for that. We try and reduce fees. We try and support the operating budget ways that we can, that we're allowed to. And that's the nature of those revolving accounts, right? That's what they're there for, and they're intended for very specific things. You know, while we're on the subject, the same as our gift accounts, right? It's another special revenue fund that we show. When gift money comes in, people give the gift for a very specific reason. It can only be used for that reason. So that's why those accounts are there. If for some reason we don't have an opportunity to spend those dollars within that year, they're earmarked for programs that are coming down the road.
Mr.
I did have a question on the revenue accounts. And when someone pays, I know a bus fee, you pay a bus fee, it's going right to the bus. That's pretty easy. A sports fee, what is a sports fee allowed to pay for? Can it be used on the fields? You know, can it be used on equipment? Can it be used on transportation?
Yeah,
Or all of the above?
it has to be related to athletics, right? So
Okay.
I think the things that you're talking about are targeted towards athletics.
So if I were to, my son didn't play sports, he did other things, but so he played football, and it was $200 a year to play football. I don't know what the fee is. Again, my kids have been out for 8 to 10 years. 300. Okay, so that $300 is also helping pay for equipment if there's equipment broken that year or not. But he's also using the equipment that was paid for by someone else earlier. So I'm saying that I can see why some of that would be held over because, you know, he's not buying a new set of pads every year, right? It's using through, but every 5 or 10 years you have to buy new pads, or if there's a mandated, you have to have the new helmet. Like in, NFL, you see some of them wearing the extra padded helmets. So for those things, I definitely understand why they would be exceeded balances at the end of the year, and that you expect that at some point it's going to be spent. And I would say it's probably spent most of the time that student's there, but there'll be some that won't be. But someone else paid extra at one point.
Athletics, there's 3 main categories for our revolving accounts for athletics. It's transportation, it's coaches, and it's rental of athletic fields, of hockey rinks, of different things that we need to use throughout the course of the year.
And for those sports, if we make the playoffs, does that mean more transportation gets spent, and that means more rink time gets bought?
That's an excellent example, because year to year, you might have some different pieces. The other piece that, and I referred to this in the workshop with the school committee and the select board the other night, is that if at the end of a fiscal year, we have town appropriated dollars, where we have saved, we've come in under expectations in some way, Mr. Girardi will go through and reallocate with the authorization of the school committee across accounts to balance out those accounts and exhaust the town appropriated allocation. If in a year we're able to then do that in a way, maybe we save some money in a certain contracted service, we end up with let's say $25,000 under. He might take that $25,000, increase the athletic department town appropriation that paid for some of those buses in the playoffs, and not expend some of the revolving account dollars, which we can carry forward. Because we can't carry forward the athletic dollars that are in the town appropriated budget. So it's a way to manage costs from year to year. In transportation, I mentioned this on Monday night, the year after COVID, we really exceeded our bus fee revenue significantly because, frankly, more kids came back riding the bus than we anticipated. Those dollars get carried over. When we shifted our start times a year or 2 later, we actually had a need for a couple of additional buses, plus just some different transportation pieces and opening the new Beale, and that changed routes and things like that. So we were able to leverage some dollars we carried forward without putting more pressure on the budget. Again, as Mr. Girardi referred to, our straight contract with AA Transportation, 6% year over year. we're only increasing the town budget for aid transportation by about 4 point something%, because we're buying that rate down by leveraging the fees that families pay us. And then, the larger piece, obviously, Mr. Girardi's talking about a lot of the specifics here. I think the question you would have to ask yourself is, if somehow the school department is sitting on all kinds of money and not using it, like, why would we do that? If we had dollars we could use to pay for teachers, would we be able to do some of the 2 point whatever million dollars that our leaders asked for that we could really benefit kids? Of course we could, and we would. Are there areas that over time we monitor? And, some years spend more and others out of those revolving accounts? Do we keep balances in them as to be fiscally responsible and cover ourselves in case of difficult times? Yes, we do that too. I think it's been well managed. It's something that, any sense that somehow we're not telling the whole story, or like we're spending money that we're not telling the town about, is just not, it's not accurate. The money we spend is in that end of year report. It's audited very carefully. And, certainly I'm very comfortable standing behind how we manage those finances over time.
And just one final, just follow up, and then I'll let everyone else go and I'll be quiet. I can understand, Greg's point that some parents are saying, hey, I'm paying this, and it's being used on some other kid. It's basically what we're saying, is that, I paid $300 for football, I expect all $300 to benefit my kid. That is, to me, is not realistic. It's where we'd like to be, but there's always going to be differences. I mean, we talk about our town taxes. We don't all get the same benefit in our town taxes. Some people that have sidewalks that are plowed or snow blowed, I don't have mine. I have to go do my own. But I'm paying the same basic tax rate. So I understand the frustration a lot of people may have, and I can understand that. But in reality, I don't think we're doing anything inappropriate. We're trying to fund a sports program that will, in that particular case, that will last and serve the community more than 1 year. It's going to serve the community for 5 or 10 years. I mean, we had a string of hockey championships in this town. We've had a string of football championships going down to Foxborough. I think 2 or 3 times we went down there. Those are things that will happen, and some kids will get advantage of it because they'll be on those teams. Others won't, but they have to be funded, and the football players are funding it for that, or the hockey players or whatever. And I don't think there's anything inappropriate the way you guys are doing it. Unless,
David?
It's a fee question, so I'm
Go ahead.
okay. I understand you don't know how much you're going to use every year. You set a fee, it comes in, it rolls over. It's good to have defensive funds. That's appropriate. But fees are probably one of the few negative things I hear about the schools, right? The high fees. And what is the barrier of dropping? I know we mentioned inflation, but I don't think that's as I think there's more to it than that. Like, why are we not looking at reducing those fees a little bit? Because it is, again, in the community I talked to, it's one of the few things people say, but our fees, everywhere you go is a fee.
I think, historically, we became dependent on fees because the appropriated budget could not provide what we needed for educational services. And we introduced fees. And as that structural deficit grew, we had to increase fees, so to not increase class size, reduce programs, and we became overly dependent by necessity. We would love to decrease fees. We talk about it all the time, but that would mean what we decrease in fees, we would need to have made up somewhere else. Possibly it could be the appropriate budget, and it's a large amount of money. I mean, Chris, the total amount that we take in fees it's significant.
It's about
And we depend
$1.2
on
million, I think, across the board.
So it's about 1.2% of your budget.
Yeah, a little bit more.
And just a reminder that the school committee did reduce fees last year.
We did.
That was part of our budget presentation, and that was an amount that was shifted to the appropriated budget, because we reduced, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, it was what, 320 to 300 for athletics, and 325,
300.
300 for transportation. We eliminated the activity fee,
At the middle and high schools.
middle of high school about 5 years ago, maybe, or so.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So the school committee has made efforts, but that is there's an amount of money we need to maintain our services, and if we're using money out of the fee bucket, then we would, need to offset that somewhere else in order to maintain that level. You know, if over time, if there were a scenario, it doesn't seem like it's gonna be happening because of some of the growth that'll be happening and whatnot, where, let's say we needed to reduce our school buses by 2 or 3, we could reduce the fleet that we need to bring our kids back and forth to school every day, and our overall transportation costs went down. My guess is the school committee would look very seriously at reducing the fees commensurately, because there'd be less cost to have to fund. But I mean, the school committee has made it very clear in their strategic planning these last few years that reducing the impact or reducing the number of fees or the amount of fees has been something they'd like to do. This year, my recommendation, because the budget is tight, was to hold them steady, and the school committee agreed to do that. Did not increase them, so, you know, in a net way, we're not gonna absorb any inflation. That 6% inflation in transportation is not, we're not increasing our transportation fees by 6% to have the same ratio. We'll be more reliant on the school department budget next year for transportation than this year on that calculation in terms of inflation. Again, how much we push in for fees. Some years we collect more than others. We make judgments about how much we offset, and then have some defensive funds, as you mentioned.
I'm gonna let Craig just continue in a minute, but I just wanna throw out one thing. When 2.5 was imposed upon us, it always was, 2.5 is what you get, and the rest will come in fees. You will have to determine what fees you want to charge to the taxpayer in the town you live in. That's the way the law was, cut and dry on you. So most of you people are too young to
Not
remember.
me, Gene.
But
I'm with you, Gene.
Clearly, because it was tough when it was first implemented. Craig, I'm gonna let you continue on.
Yeah, my point, and I'm legitimately asking questions on it, because like my math on athletics would say you could reduce the fees to $250 a student, and you still, you wouldn't have a $70,000 surplus in that in a given year, but you know that you're gonna have new students and they're gonna participate every year, so it's somewhat stable, I would imagine, is what your revenue is, and you probably would know what the life cycle of equipment is, so you could plan for that depreciation when it was gonna need to be replaced. So I think some of this is just talking about planning, and, you know, extended day, there's an $82,000 surplus there on a yearly basis, so that's really for the staffing there, so you know what your costs are. So my whole point in this is just, is there a look at the fees and saying, are we charging what we really need to put it on? Because I would think these services we should not be, say, profitable or in surplus. I know you're gonna have that, but I'm saying some of these, that's the only point I'm making in my statement. And then on school lunch, I do have one question, and because I have heard it, I've seen it. You know, students who have late lunch complain that we run out of food. If I like salads, I don't have the ability to get it. I will have a healthy option, yet we have $2.4 million that we have to spend on food, and we just said that has to be spent on food. So how are we running out of food at late lunch when it's not a cost issue? So I think that's a valid question as well.
I'll just say that we're not running out of food. There are some days when certain options are very popular, and they'll get chosen first by the students who go through first. What our food services do is they have an algorithm. They have their data that shows how many meals they're serving by the lunch that they serve. If they underestimate, they factor that in, and they have those meals prepared for the next time that they serve that meal. So there are days where, by the last lunch, there are fewer options. They make that adjustment, and, by the time that next cycle goes through, they have those meals in place.
Okay. One quick question that I do have like 2 remaining questions, I'm sorry. I do have a clarification, I'm just curious, on the actual enrollment, because on page 43 that was talked about, there's a set of figures shown, but on the presentation that was given on the 25th, there's different enrollment numbers. It was page 8 of the presentation that was the special ed and student services on the 25th, where there's about a 200 student delta. So it says there's 6,045 students that was presented on the 25th, but it says 5847. So all the years from, let's say, 2021 and onward do not match between this book and what was presented on the 25th. So which one is correct?
I'm not sure what you're looking at, but these are K-12 numbers. Oftentimes we'll do pre-K-12 numbers. It's about a 200 student differential. Without knowing what the information that you're looking at is, that would be my guess.
It was I'll tell you, it was during the Special Ed and Student Services FY27 overview, which was presented on February 25th. But if that's what it is, it's good to know.
What slide is that, Greg?
It was page 8. I don't know what slide, I don't know if it's slide 8, but it's page 8. My last question, which is more of just a financial question, it actually goes back to C1, which is related to special education, the budget category C1. Yeah, and what's not shown on here that I think is really important is the budgeted version. So for FY25, I believe it was 2.8 something million. And the reason why I think it's important is I believe my analysis that I did is correct, and it's really a hypothetical. And I'm not trying to make a policy decision, because I believe this is policy, and that's what the school committee is chartered with doing. But it's just a legitimate question to make sure I understand how this math works. So for example, in 2025, there was a presentation in the budget book that gives the estimated end-of-year reserve balance, and it shows what was being spent. So essentially, the actual net end-of-year reserve was somewhere around $2.7 million. If the 50% model was used with the carry forward, it would have been 1.9. So there's essentially a gap of $747,000 between what initially would have been, let's say, proposed to draw down on that reserve versus what was actually used. And the reason I bring that up is that's effectively, that $747,000, a 0.86% of the total budget. So my kind of question is, what I've seen as a pattern over the last few years is that the reserve fund is not being drawn down to that 50% level, which is the policy of the school committee. But if it was done that way in, say, 2025, my calculations say you could have spent, the school committee could have spent the exact same amount of money, could have provided the same services in 2025, yet the appropriation from the town could have been at a 3.35% increase instead of the 4.25% increase, because it was following policy, drawing down and sticking to the original budgeted town appropriation for that category. I know that was a lot and it's a little bit confusing, but I was just, what I'm seeing is that more money is allocated into the special education bucket than what's budgeted from the town appropriation. By doing that, drawing down less on a circuit breaker reserve, which I understand it's important to have a reserve. But if that reserve is never drawn down to, say, 0, and even if it did, the finance committee yourselves are here, the town's reserves are there to support that. I'm not suggesting we're going to draw down to that level, but even to the 50% level, where we've kept it much higher. So when we're looking at, we talked about it earlier, that we have a lot of budget challenges, outside of just the school committee. Municipal budgets are challenged as well. So this 0.5 percentage point we're talking about, that $451,000, if there's options of where we can still meet level service and utilize the funds we have, I understand we want to have buffer. I get it. But I'm just asking, is that possible the way I've stated it? And these questions I've asked to Chris. This is not new. I just want to make that clear. These questions are asked 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I haven't got answers. So part of the reason I'm here is because I haven't got a response to those questions. So this isn't out of the blue. So that's why I'm coming here to ask, is that an accurate statement? That had that been done, could a 3.35% increase made the math work?
Do you want to say anything, or?
Do we have that slide in the book somewhere?
These are other slides just to answer questions.
It's essentially, it's effectively page 38, but it's not from, It's not from this year, I apologize for that, because we don't have actuals for FY27 or 26. So it would have been essentially the 2026 budget book to be able to look at it. But I only brought up the C1 just because it can see consistently like for the last 3 fiscal years, when you look at budget to actual, there's always more of the allocated budget has been going to special education than originally budgeted, so that we don't have to draw down from the circuit breaker reserve as planned and as shown. So the plan, I always look at this as saying, this is what we're going to do, or we're gonna do our best to meet the budget. And the last few years, things have changed, and it's been in our benefit by not having to draw down on that. But those are a source of funds specifically for that use, that then we would not need as much town appropriated money to offset, is my point that I'm trying to make.
Before Mr. Girardi speaks, I do want to just mention, and then the school committee is happy to reinforce this as they'd like. The fiscal policy the school committee has been following the last many years is that the 50% benchmark is the minimum of what they would prefer to have. That 100% would be outstanding, 75% would be, I forget what the term we used in our table, but very solid, for lack of a better term, and that 50% would be adequate. And that they have said many times on camera that they would prefer to have more than 50% if possible. The additional spending, in a end of year versus current year, and that's up, Mr. Girardi has it there. So superior, strong, adequate, and if you bump down to 25%, that would be perceived to be inadequate. So one thing just to remind the Finance Committee, we talked about in this past years, this reserve that we utilize, the circuit breaker reserve, is not only for potential fluctuations or volatility in special education. It's for anything that we might run into in terms of the entire school department budget. As a mechanism, we can only spend these circuit breaker dollars on special education costs that are eligible. And so at the end of a fiscal year, again, and we, as we do fiscal updates throughout a fiscal year, we're very clear, and when we end the year, we try to be very clear about how many dollars under budget we anticipate coming in. It's usually well within 1% of our allocation. That we're going to take those dollars and we're going to push them into circuit breaker to carry forward to the next year, because that's our mechanism. As a result, whatever that might be, let's say we're saving $200,000 on our appropriated budget. What we will do is take $200,000 and increase the special education tuition spend out of the appropriated budget, instead of using $200,000 that we would have used out of circuit breaker, so that we can preserve those dollars. When we did our first update for this current fiscal year, we had clarified a couple things. First off, that how much we were going to have in the bank year over year had exceeded our expectation because of some of those savings, and also was an unusual year because the state actually allocated an additional $280,000 plus to bring us whole on what we should have been getting for a reimbursement all along for special education transportation. So that as of December, our current year had gone up to 57.77%. Very transparent. Very clear about where the numbers were. But from year to year, we have an estimate, and then what it actually is going to depend on how we end the year in a variety of ways. The other piece, and Mr. Girardi will want to speak to this in a moment, but I think what's being suggested is actually what we're actually doing. Because if you go back to the actual, Mr. Girardi, if you don't mind, sorry, the display from earlier, that category, C, I think it is.
C1.
The way that we are able to reduce each of these years in terms of what, the budget and the 4.5% reduction of $112,000 is because we have adequate circuit breaker money that we have in the bank now and we're anticipating receiving next year, that we can essentially buy that down and take pressure off of the town appropriated budget in terms of going into what our plan would be next year. The difference is, in terms of, what we currently estimate our total tuitions, the total cost of our out-of-district tuitions, this year, our budgeted number is about 7.55 million. Next year, it's estimated to be about 7.79 million, 7.8 million. So that's a $243,000 increase that we are absorbing, plus we're taking it down by another $112,000. So the net impact of that is about $355,000 that we're able to offset, taking pressure off of the town appropriated budget, allowing us to do other things with those dollars. At the end of this fiscal year, if we come in under our total amount, we're not going to be over, depending on how much we come under, whatever our budgeted number for FY26 will likely go up by that same amount. So the actual is going to be that we spent more out of our appropriated budget and maybe saved more of circuit breaker. Obviously, the benchmark moves every year because it depends on what we receive from the state. The 50% is relative to how much we can carry forward. The most we can carry forward is 1 full year's worth of reimbursement. So if we get $4 million from the state in 1 year, we could only carry over that amount in circuit breaker. And obviously, we're much closer to the 50% mark than the 100% mark. So this is all measured in what we do, how we do it. It is not that the school committee only wants to have a 50% buffer. They'd like to have more than that. They'd much rather be closer to the 75%. But because of that very reason that we know we have to buffer what we actually are able to get from the town and to spend on what we need to do to preserve our programming, those are the decisions we've been making year to year. And I would suggest in a very transparent way. Mr. Girardi, could you go to that other slide that you had about the prediction versus the actuals of what we received every year? And could you just describe what this slide shows?
Sure. So every year in December, January, we make a projection, right? We have students that are currently out of district. We know what their tuition is. We get the inflation rate from the OSD, and we then take those students who are going to be with us the next year. We apply that inflation rate, and that gives us an estimate of the cost that we're going to have without any assumptions about new students coming in, right? We have, there are some students that we're keeping our eye on, but at the early time, I mean, it's raw data that we're looking at, and we have a formula that we use that at that time is conservative. And what that does is it says, over the last 5 years, here's been kind of the percentage increase that we've seen based on the students that we have. That percentage that's made, and that's the dollar amount that we predict we're going to receive in reimbursement the next year based on the students that we currently have. That's an important number to us, because that's, those dollars coming in, that's what we need to rely upon to then understand what we can spend out of circuit breaker, which then forces us to understand how much we need to pull out of the appropriated budget. So our, when we're making those predictions, this is the last 5 fiscal years of our prediction versus what's actually come in. And when we're looking at kind of the models that we use, and we say that every year it's coming in over, we're working on these predictions that help us understand how we're trying to right fit the dollars that are coming in. And over time, those numbers change. These are ever-moving numbers. We meet with our special education department and look at students out of district every week, because it can change by $200,000, it can change by $300,000 within a week. So it's a very volatile program, and this is, so having said that, the last 5 fiscal years, our circuit breaker reimbursements we've been accurate within 1.77% of our prediction versus what we've received. So it's fairly accurate. Some years we come in a little bit under, and those predictions then would lead to more dollars coming in that we hadn't anticipated, and we're able to make those adjustments. Some years, such as FY25, we over-predicted. We thought some students would meet the circuit breaker threshold, and they did not. And so we were over by $100,000, and we needed to respond to that. So it's a fair estimate. We come close, but those percentages, it's a big dollar number. And when you're off by a little bit, it can be real dollars, right? So it's an important piece to, as you know, when we're building our circuit breaker understanding, and what we're trying to do is know what we need to expense in the operating budget and what we can use in the circuit breaker budget, with again having, you know, talk about, you know, a fiscal reserve that we're talking about $8 million budget where it can fluctuate $300,000 very quickly. That's a place where we feel it's fiscally responsible to hold a certain amount of dollars. Many districts that are in, you know, we showed that slide around our comparable districts across the state. A lot of those districts carry 100% circuit breaker because they're not willing to run the risk of having those tuitions impact other programming. We don't have that luxury, right? So we've tried to do that. There were some years where, you know, we were there, we're not there now.
One year.
Yeah.
The 1 year
Yeah.
post, when they increased the formula and they started reimbursing more fully on transportation, we carried the full amount, and we had a strong year fiscally, locally. But other than that, we've been really close to the 50% benchmark. But I'd you know, defer to the school committee in terms of their sense of why they've charged us with trying to maintain, if at all possible, more than 50%. And again, it's a combination of what are we going to get, and then other savings from the budget that then we are able to move forward through that mechanism. So again, we're protected year to year, so.
We just think it's the fiscally responsible thing to do, to hold that money, to be able to, you know, present against, I mean, a $500,000 swing in this category is not unheard of, and it can happen very quickly. So to hold this, you know, this reserve is, we believe, is the fiscally responsible thing to do.
If I could just add to, prior to the, I'm sorry.
Yo, go ahead.
Prior to the override in 2021, we were barely able to keep a reserve of about $500,000, right? So post-override, we saw it as fiscally responsible to do this. We'd love to keep 100%, we're at 50, right? And that we have that buffer, but to really understand the special education space, you have to understand the volatility. And we have no, like, we couldn't tell you, like, in terms of move-ins and what services would be needed, that buffer is there for us. And we haven't had that prior to the override. We've been able to stay at about 50%. We were higher, but it's there if in the event of an emergency.
Okay.
So,
Your sense was,
Do you, off the top of your head, know what like the top four payments or top four special ed students, for lack of
The tuitions.
tuitions, are?
We have Ms. Belzito's report from February 25th has that information. I think right now our highest tuition somewhere around $490,000.
So if a student with a similar issue moved in, we would need to come up with I'm just looking at the big number switch that you talked about, and this is, because my understanding, I know we had even higher single students before because they were like over 7-day overnight type of thing. I can understand keeping that budget in because that, you know, again, I don't think we should ever be at 100 personally, because we do have free cash and we can, it's not guaranteed we would use it, but we could. But I do think having a healthy buffer with the cost of special ed, with the cost that you can get with special ed is probably prudent. And I do think,
get back to my question, which wasn't answered.
yeah,
Because on this slide, because the other part you're not sharing, I shouldn't say you're not sharing, but there's more to the story because on this gap, the actual tuition costs were also $475,000 lower, which means we didn't have to pay that. And that is also at that same year when the reserve was at 2.7 million, but in that actual year's budget, it was allowed to be down to 2 million. Because if you remember, the 50%, just to be clear, 50% of 3.9 million is 1.953 million. And the end balance of that reserve that year was 2.7. So once again, there's a $747,000 gap between what was shown if you add all the numbers together. So my question, would you have been able to meet obligations, same amount of budget at the 3.35% town appropriated budget? Yes or no?
The policy, our policy, just like you have policies as select board members, and we are saying that this is the fiscally responsible piece to have. So at a 3.25 or 3.5% budget is, I think, what you're stating?
I said a 3.35% increase over the prior year, you would have been able to spend the same amount of money if the town appropriation was 3.35% increase instead of the 4.25, if the model and the policy for the circuit breaker was followed. That is my question. Is that possible? I'm not saying you should do it, I'm just saying, is that an accurate statement, that would have been possible? That's all I'm
I
asking.
mean, I personally, there's a lot of verbiage that, you went through and, it's,
I had
I
it
don't see
in,
numbers.
I had it in an email, Joe. You have the email. You've had the email twice. So I'm just asking if it's true. If you don't want to answer, just say you don't want to answer.
It's not that I don't want to answer, Mr. Richards. I think that, we've met with you and gave you time at one point. You asked for 2 more hours of time, which quite frankly is a, significant piece. I know that, Mr. Mizikar has had conversation with you. I think that in terms of there were a lot of elements of this, in terms of, we can look through those numbers, but, to again, as a revolving account that we utilize over the course of a year and make decisions at the end of a fiscal year in terms of how much we might spend on something, those numbers change a lot at the very end of the fiscal year. So, we don't know how much we're going to save over the course of fiscal year at the start of it. So I would say conceptually, we do not necessarily know. I mean, this year, we ended up with, 57% instead of 50. The school committee's policy is not take those dollars and get us down to 50 and offset them. If there was a year where there was more, those are elements that, again, it's not a hard and fast rule to follow the policy, you have to be at 50. But those numbers shift and depend on which point of the year you're looking at. And so, again, the dollars that come in, the dollars we save year to year that we move into it, that we report out on each year in terms of what that's at, how those numbers can fluctuate in terms of special education. As a mathematical, I will certainly defer that if you do the math out, you could say, well, that's the difference between where we ended up in the number and what our overall budget was for the year. But I don't think it's quite as neat to say, like, at the start of the fiscal year, we could have reduced our budget by X and just used that fund to do it. I don't think it's quite that neat.
Have you got any more?
No,
Yeah.
that was my final.
I would
Final
just
question.
like to add, is there anybody else in the audience who has additional questions before I just want to add a comment? I see none. I just want to point out, there's a large amount of dollars difference between what the town manager has given us for a figure and what the school committee has given. I just hope that we can go forward, work this out, look at this overall budget, and see if we can come to some conclusion that's kind of in the middle, so that everybody will be happy. If I had to gamble, I would say to Chapter 70, you're definitely gonna get some money from down in Boston. The way it looks right now, it's on the table. I don't see it being defeated in any way, so I think that's something that should be done over the next couple of weeks, and then we meet again in April, and we can iron this whole thing out, so everybody is happy and we go forward on there. But I was kind of surprised myself that it was maxed out on the first projection. I didn't remember seeing that in the past number of years where the budget came in. We always had negotiation amounts that we could work with in the budget itself. So that's the way I like to leave it, and unless there's any other.
I just had one question. I would like to thank Mr. Richards for bringing up these questions. I think it led to a good, sharing of information and understanding of what's going on. It gave me a deeper understanding of some of the internals of how you're running the budget. So I do think it was worthwhile having those questions, and just want to say that. But I think we'll take all of that into advisement as we go forward.
Will we be having access to these slides?
Yeah.
So the slides that were shared tonight were just the presentation slides. We had some below the deck slides that we didn't want to overwhelm people with in real time. We'll get these out to you right away. All the slides below the deck so they can have them.
Thank you.
If there isn't anything else, we thank you very much for the presentation and your time, and good night to you
Thank
people.
you.
and
Thank you.
Appreciate it, thank
We've
you.
got a couple more things to talk about here. The first item, is there any other business we need to discuss? Anybody else? No business? Okay. I think we've pretty much gone over the meeting schedules, unless somebody has some questions.
Just had a quick question. These April ones, are they going to happen here? We know.
The meetings?
Yeah.
Yes, all the public hearings, as far as I know, we've got this room, and we've got the 6 PM starting time on them, so I think that'll work out well on there. And if there isn't anything else, I'll have a motion to continue the public hearing till Saturday morning at 8:30 AM.
No, I don't.
So moved.
Thank you, though.
Got some things rolling.
Need a second?
I like the sticker on the door when you walk in.
I guess we can adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.
Aye.